at the University of Texas and then at the University of Brasilia. He then continued at the University of Brasilia for 4 years as a visiting professor before beginning his current position at North Carolina State University. So we welcome Bill and thank you for accepting our invitation. And whenever you want, you can share your screen and it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. I'm really quite flattered to have the invitation to present to you all. So thank you very much, Emma and Yadvinder. I really appreciate it. Now, for some of you who have seen me speak before, you may have seen some or all of this at some point. And so to you, I apologize. This is a summary of some aspects of many years of research on the topic. So first I want to start with some acknowledgements to people, collaborators who have contributed in some way to the data that I'll be presenting. At the University of Brasilia, Augusto Franco and Mundayatsan Haridasan, and a couple of postdocs, Erica Geiger and Sybil Gosch, and a number of undergraduates have worked at our site near Brasilia. But then at a site where we have a more recent project studying fire at Savanna-Forest boundaries in southeastern Brazil, Giselle de Durgan, David Rosato, and Rodolfo Abreu, who are my primary Brazilian collaborators, along with a couple of PhD students who have worked, Sam Flake and Natasha Pilon, and a couple of undergraduate students who have contributed some of the work that I'll be presenting here. So thanks to all of you. So since 1991, I've been working in the cerrado system. This is a mesic savanna system primarily, which means it's pretty high rainfall. Almost all of the cerrado receives more than 1,000 millimeters of rainfall per year, and a large portion receives even more than 1,500 millimeters per year. So, as far as savannas go, pretty wet. And so, in addition to a large range of savanna physiognomies that can be found across the landscape, we do have substantial areas of a closed canopy tropical forest. And here, just like in every savanna of the world, the quintessential question is, what determines tree cover in savannas? And it's hard to overstate just how important this question is, because the tree cover drives almost every other aspect of the ecology of savanna ecosystems. So this is really an important question, but a special case of this question is, what is it that determines the distribution of forest in savanna? Now, this at first glance, this may appear to be just really just a simple case of the previous question, but there are some really important ways in which this question is distinct from the former. One, for example, is the fact that once you get to a closed canopy forest, you have the disappearance of all these savanna grasses, these C4 grasses. When you are dealing with the transition from savanna to forest, suddenly these feedbacks between vegetation structure and flammability become very important for driving the system, whereby savanna is highly flammable, which promotes burning, which maintains it as an open state, whereas in the forest, it is much less flammable and therefore can persist often even in a landscape that it may be burning around it. So this is another way in which the transition between the savanna and forest is unique and important, interesting as well. But then a third way in which the transition between savanna and forest is unique is that, unlike when you go from an open savanna to a fairly closed savanna, you have pretty much the same species present. There may be some species in the denser savanna that are not open in a nearby open savanna, but regardless, it's a measure of, it's a quantitative change rather than a qualitative change. However, once you go from even a fairly dense savanna to a true closed canopy forest, you have a wholesale change in the species that are present. The species, there's relatively little overlap in the species that are present in these two. And this becomes really important because in many of our savannas, as has been noted in savannas elsewhere in the world, we do have this problem of woody encroachment and encroachment of forest. And a study that was led by Rodolfo Abreu that we recently published, that looking at the consequences of forest encroachment at a site where fire has been suppressed for a period of time, we see that as the tree basal area increases as you go from pretty much open grassland to these recent forests, you have initially a very modest increase in the number of species of plants, but then it starts to drop off sharply as we transition to really a closed canopy system. And if we look at it, considering these species that are typical of forest versus typical of savanna, yeah, we have this increase of the number of savanna species present, but what's most alarming is this massive drop off in the presence of the number of savanna species. And this is alarming because as the savannas become more and more fragmented and fire regimes become disrupted and more areas become encroached by forest, these are the species that we're most concerned about losing. And you can't maintain those if you're not maintaining the savanna structure. An important aspect of this is that somewhere on the order of perhaps 80% of the plants endemic to savanna are in Brazil are these herbaceous plants. And even though I won't be talking about herbaceous plants, they're really important in terms of biodiversity. And these in particular are very vulnerable to forest encroachment. And if we look at not broken down by habitat or preference, but if we look at it by plant functional type, as you go from this open savanna to forest, sure, you have this increase of tree species diversity, but all of these smaller growth forms, the shrubs, the forbs, the graminoids, they're all dropping off very, very alarmingly as forest encroaches. So very important consequences for biodiversity. But as I said, I'm not going to be talking about the herbaceous plants other than as fuel. But what's really I'm going to focus on is these differences between savanna and forest species. And here's an example of two closely related species, one being a forest species and one being a savanna species. And the differences you see here are really typical of these two functional types. So the forest species, much more regular architecture, much more sort of regular, efficient display of leaves, thinner bark, compared to the savanna species where you have this thick bark and really irregular architecture and open canopy that lets a lot of light through. Here's another example, two species of Simplocos. You've got the regular architecture, thin bark, versus the savanna species with thick bark and irregular architecture. And you see this time and time again, to the point that you can very quickly learn to, with a fair deal of confidence, distinguish what's a savanna and what's a forest species. So it's interesting to note that there is a vast diversity of savanna woody plants in the Cerrado. And just going by the number of genera which contain both savanna and forest species, there has been at least 115 independent origins of savanna species or savanna lineages from within forest lineages. And this is really useful if you want to understand the adaptations to the savanna environment, because you can easily, if you have a location where where there's a high diversity of both savanna and forest species, where under fire suppression, forest species have encroached into the savanna, you can easily pick out species pairs, closely related species pairs, and under similar growing conditions, focus on the differences within these species pairs. So this is what we've taken advantage of to a great extent in our work around Brasilia in the center of the Cerrado region. And now, looking at this from a evolutionary perspective can provide a lot of insights into the ecology of the system and what might control the tree density. And the reason for this, my logic here is that any factor that's going to limit tree success in the savanna is going to be a factor which also is going to very strongly shape natural selection. Because if trees are not successful in a given environment due to some factor, well, that's going to impose strong selective pressure on which individuals or which species survive. And so, if we have a trait that shows a great deal of convergent evolution within the savanna environment, that provides strong evidence that natural selection has really shaped that trait to a great extent, and it can provide some insights into what factors might limit tree success. So what are some, so the first part of my talk is going to address this question of what traits show strong signs of convergent evolution in the savanna environment. And the second part is going to focus on what are the consequences of these adaptations for the vegetation dynamics in savanna and between savanna forest transitions. So first of all, and I'm going to be using two different types of data in this talk. One is going to focus on comparative studies of congeneric pairs of closely related savanna and forest species. And I'll forget to remind you all the time about this, but these were taken, these studies were performed in conditions in which both the savanna and the forest species were growing in either the same environment or in similar environments. In other words, open savanna environment, except for some seedling studies, which were in common nursery conditions. And then other deep measurements will come from measurements across savanna forest boundaries. So getting back to the question, what are the traits that show a great deal of convergent evolution within the savanna environment? And the kind of data I'm going to use for this is this data, these results coming from trait comparisons of congeneric species pairs. So in this particular case, seed mass, we have, I believe, 9 genera, which we have both a savanna and a forest species. And what we see when we look across this is that there's, first of all, no consistent pattern for savanna species to either have a consistently higher seed mass or a lower seed mass compared to forest species. And we can quantify that. And specifically, we find that there's that less than 1% of the total variation in seed mass across these 18 species, less than 1% of that can be explained by functional type. And so this is a case where there's no evidence of convergent evolution. But very importantly, there's a huge amount of the variation which can be explained by genus. So, if you have one species, if the forest species of the pair has large seeds, it means that the savanna species also has large seeds. And this is this high, whenever there's this strong effect of strong trait conservatism, this is very important for determining the functional diversity of communities of trees within the savanna environment, because what it tells you is that for a particular functional trait, the diversity across species in the savanna has very little to do with the fact that they are savanna species, but that diversity is much more determined by what particular lineages gave rise to those savanna species. And so, so there's a strong legacy effect that depends on which, which determines the functional diversity of the savanna species. So, but this is a very different trait. This is relative bark thickness, which is bark thickness divided by stem diameter. And here we have a larger number of genera. But if we look at this, we see that there is a general and pretty consistent tendency for the savanna species to have greater investment in bark per given stem diameter. But there's not a strong pattern across genera, whereby, for example, it's the fact that a given species has, or a given forest species has thin bark doesn't really mean that the closely related savanna species will also have thin bark. In other words, it's an evolutionarily highly labile trait. And so if we consider the amount of variance, 60% of that variance across species is explained by species type, which is evidence for very strong convergent evolution, and only 24% is explained by what genus a species belongs to. And so the very weak phylogenetic conservatism of this trait. And so the fact that you have strong convergent evolution, and because it's widely agreed that convergent evolution is strong evidence of that, this is an adaptation to a particular environment, we have strong evidence here that, whatever factor, namely fire, has probably driven the bark thickness, is going to be an important factor determining tree success in the savanna. So, so what kinds of traits show the strongest evidence for natural selection within the savanna environment? Is it water relations, a general group of resource capture and use, or is it response to fire? And it's always tricky to attribute a given trait to a specific function, because traits generally have multiple functions and are under selection by multiple factors. So, this, don't take, be a little forgiving if you don't necessarily agree with the way I've sorted these traits out by function. So the first one, now this is something I spent a lot of time quite a while back examining the differences in water relations between savanna and forest species. These are species growing in the savanna environment, and darn certain that I was going to find consistent differences between the savanna and forest species. But by and large, it was pretty boring. That we didn't find many consistent differences, which but there is certainly a great deal of phylogenetic conservatism of these traits. But in short, not a whole lot of evidence that water deficit was a strong selective factor determining tree success in these savannas. Now, something to also keep in mind, what this cannot take into account is that the species that, or the lineages that gave rise to savanna species are not necessarily a random sample of all the lineages of forest trees. And so we can't really get at how sort of that kind of influence of, there may be a tendency for relatively more drought tolerant forest species to have been the origin of savanna lineages. That would require a different kind of study. So what about this set of traits that I generally am referring here to as being related to resource uptake and growth beyond water availability? And among these, the most consistent difference we see between savanna and forest species comes down to leaf mass per area, whereby the savanna species have consistently thicker leaves, and there's relatively little phylogenetic conservatism. But generally these are, many of these were significant, but modest in their size. However, something that is important to keep in mind, I'll emphasize here, looking at just one of these. This is seedling leaf area ratio. This is leaf area per whole plant mass. And you can think of this as a measure of the amount of investment a species has towards light capture. So light capture per unit mass. And what I want to emphasize here is, certainly 80% of the variation in this trait across the study species can be explained by genus. But that leaves only 20% of variation that's not explained by genus. And now looking at how much is explained by functional type, 60% of that remaining variance that's not explained by genus is explained by functional type. And this is really important, and this is another reason why taking phylogenetic effects into account is quite important for these kinds of studies, in which we can see here. This is that same variable, but now we see how savanna and forest species differ within genera. And so you can see a very consistent genus effect that when one species has a small leaf area ratio, the other species also has a small leaf area ratio. But when you look within genera, there's a very consistent pattern whereby the forest species reliably has a higher leaf area ratio than its closely related savanna species. So this, even though, so if I had done a comparative study in which I had not been able to pair these by genera, by genus, what would we have seen? We would have, when we had gone to looking at the averages in leaf area ratio between savanna and forest species, these standard errors would be huge because of the huge amount of variation across genus. And only by being able to pair those and factoring out the effect of genus are we able to find this very strong effect of leaf area ratio. So this is just one of the benefits of being able to study this in the cerrado. And so, however, in any subsequent slides where I'm looking at mean differences between savanna and forest species, I will just be presenting it like this, in which I'll give you the average value for each functional type. And then finally, traits that are related to how species respond to fire. And of these three groups of traits, this is the group which shows the strongest, more consistent influence of plant functional type on the traits. And you've seen relative bark thickness. I've showed you that before. And the rest of these I'll explain a bit in the next slides. One is adult height, and you may wonder why I chose to put this in the group of fire response traits, because it is also related to resource acquisition. But what's something we commonly see in these savanna lineages is a reduction in plant growth form. And here you can see the benefit of having a small adult size. These are two species of Volkesia tetrasoides and Volkesia pumila. And this species has evolved a subshrub life form, which allows it to flower very readily after fire. Actually, shortly after fire, this thing is flowering and reproducing. But this sapling of this species here is very unlikely, at least in the short term, to reach sexual maturity, particularly if burning is going to be occurring readily. So it's much more challenging for a large growth form to reach sexual maturity in a frequently burned environment than if you have a small growth form. But something I also want to spend a little bit of time looking at these allocation patterns and how they relate to fire. So in looking at seedlings, we've found that savanna species have a consistently higher concentration of carbohydrates in the roots. But even more important for fire response is the difference in root-shoot ratio. There's almost a threefold difference in root-shoot ratio of savanna species compared to forest species. And if you multiply the carbohydrate concentration by the root-shoot ratio, what you get is the root carbohydrate per shoot mass. And this is important because in these savanna species, if you look at what this value is in savanna species, it shows you that on average, for every gram of above ground biomass of these seedlings, there is 0.8 grams of carbohydrate just waiting to be reallocated for production of new above ground biomass if fire were to come along and kill that above ground biomass. Whereas in the forest species, on average, there is less than 0.2 grams of carbohydrate per gram of above ground biomass. So, so that really sets the savanna species up for being able to recover and survive after fire. Now, this is a set of traits which I would not argue is probably under direct natural selection in response to fire, but I pointed out here, they'll become relevant later. And these are traits that I'm going to recall fire effect traits, which is related to how the functional types influence flammability of the ecosystem. And there are two here that I've tested, and that is, the first one is rate of leaf area accumulation, which is through time, as the tree grows, what's the rate at which the leaf area accumulates per of the stem. And that's a function of the rate of stem diameter growth, but also the allometry between stem diameter and leaf area. And both of those matter. And so forest species, as you'll see in greater detail later, have much more rapid accumulation of leaf area due to their faster growth and denser canopies. And if you look at just the crown density, the sort of LAI of the crown, that's another trait, and both of which is going to influence shading of the understory. And both of these show more convergence, a greater influence of functional type than of genus. So, so suppose you want to become a savanna tree. What do you need to know? Well, if you're a forest tree and you're dying to move into these beautiful savannas, well, first of all, no previous experience required. You've got a good chance of becoming a savanna tree under the right conditions, but you have to be adaptable. So there's going to be some lifestyle change that's going to come about as a result of moving over to the savanna environment. But importantly, there's no nepotism. It doesn't matter what family you've come from. Virtually every family of neotropical woody plants, or a large number of them, have given rise to savanna lineages. So no nepotism, and diversity is welcome. Your unique background and the background you bring because of your lineages is going to bring functional diversity to the savanna. So that's our first half of the talk. The second half, what are the consequences of these adaptations for ecosystem properties and for vegetation dynamics? So something that was really surprising in our comparative studies, which unfortunately we didn't have, in the earlier work, we didn't have the opportunity to do our own burning, to do experimental burning, and we had to take advantage of occasional wildfires and individual wildfires. But something that was just extremely surprising, and you could have made a lot of money. Would have been willing to bet a lot of money 15 years ago that forest species established in the savanna were going to have much lower survival compared. The forest species were going to have much lower survival than savanna species. But we were never able to detect this for established individuals. Now, we have some evidence for a rather small number of species, and there's evidence from elsewhere that as seedlings, forest species are much more vulnerable to fire. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of comparative data for that. And something else we've found, and I'm not showing you a graph for this, that really savanna species are not, contrary to what I had expected, savanna species are not more vigorous resprouters in terms of what fraction of their initial biomass they're able to recover in, say, the first year after fire. There's no tendency for savanna species to resprout more vigorously or more quickly. So these are really surprising for me, but unfortunately, as I mentioned, we didn't have the opportunity to examine these things under repeated burning. And hopefully fairly soon, maybe after our next census, we'll be able to look at how repeated burning in this fire experiment, which we now have in southeastern Brazil at the transition between the Cerrado and the Atlantic forest, where we're doing repeated burnings at 3 different savanna forest boundaries. Hopefully at some point in the future, I suspect we will detect strong differences in fire response between the savanna and forest species. But anyway, we don't have that evidence just as of yet, except for the differences they exhibit in terms of a topkill. And these are data from a number of sites after wildfire in Brasilia, examining how the savanna and forest species, as a function of stem diameter, how they differ in the probability that they will lose their above ground biomass in response to burning. And what you see is that consistently the forest species will have will more likely lose their above ground biomass. And that comes down largely to their thicker bark. Now, so this is important because of this paradigm that we refer to in the savanna literature as the fire trap, that goes like this: that in the savanna, you have a sapling is growing in the savanna. Give it some time without fire, it grows into a larger sapling, but fire is frequent in the savanna, so eventually fire comes along and knocks it back, and it has to resprout and go through this again. And this is something that savanna species are able to tolerate repeated topkill quite readily. But if you now give this larger sapling a longer time without fire, that gives it the opportunity to eventually become a larger tree, and maybe an adult tree, which, when burning comes, it's able to resist that fire and is able to persist in the landscape as a large tree. And since these large trees have a much larger influence on vegetation structure than does these little saplings, this transition is quite important for determining vegetation structure. Now, anything that speeds up tree growth or shortens the amount of time necessary to transition between a fire resistant stem, that's going to influence the number of trees that are able to grow up and have its influence on the vegetation structure. Now, you can see this quite readily. These are photos from longleaf pine systems in North Carolina, which we also work on. These are, in terms of woody plant diversity, these are not very diverse. Essentially here you have 2 species. You have the overstory longleaf pine, and then you have these resprouts of turkey oak or Quercus laevis. And what you see here is the classic fire trap, where you have all these little saplings that, because this particular site is burned every 3 years, they really don't have the opportunity to reach a size that it's fire resistant. But now, I mean, if you look at the number of these saplings that are in the understory, if you suppressed fire, even if a small fraction of these grow up to an adult size, it has a transformative effect on the structure of the vegetation. Okay, so getting back to the cerrado system, so combining information from a large number of burns and a large number of individual stems, thousands of individual stems, we have good information on the relationship between bark thickness and the probability of stem survival. Based on our comparative studies, we have good information. This is many dozens of species, but each point is an individual plant. We have good information on the relationship differ in terms of growth rate. So the savanna species have thicker bark, but the forest species grow more quickly. And for the study species, in our case, that doesn't quite compensate for the differences in bark thickness. But using this kind of information, you can make a simple projection like this, where if you if you project out time since burning and the bark thickness for savanna and forest species, the savanna species accumulate bark owing to their greater investment in bark. They accumulate bark thickness more rapidly, and for whatever threshold bark thickness, in this case, approximately 6 millimeters gives you a 50% chance of surviving a low intensity fire. That threshold bark thickness you can use to estimate for at least an average stem how much time is necessary for that sapling to grow up to a fire resistant size. And just an average, and now there's good information that averages here probably are not the best way to, or definitely not the best way to examine escaping the fire trap, but this, I am looking at average. For like the average individual, for savanna species, you would, in the cerrado, need 8 years to escape the fire trap, but 14 years for the average forest species. Now, there's a lot of variation within and among species, so just because the average might not be able to escape within 14 years, maybe the fastest growing species or the fastest growing individuals might. So, so anyway, this regardless of all that nuance, this makes forest species much more susceptible to the fire trap. Makes it much more difficult for it to. It needs a much more longer period of time without fire to become adults. But there's also an analogous fire trap at the ecosystem scale, which has been named the landscape fire trap. And it's much the same, where you have an open savanna, give it some time without fire, it becomes a slightly denser savanna, but fire will keep it open and as long as it's frequent. But give that same site a longer time without fire, and based on how quickly the tree cover is increasing and how dense the tree cover has to be to suppress fire, it may become dense enough so that when fire does come along, it does not burn through that patch and is therefore protected from fire. Now, as in the previous trap, the rate of canopy closure and the density required to suppress fire are very important factors which are going to influence how likely this is going to happen in a given fire regime. So, these here I'm going to quickly go over some recent results that were largely collected by two great hardworking undergraduate students who spent a summer at our research site, in which we and Rodolfo Abreu, who when I wasn't there was overseeing and contributing to this work, in which we had a meteorological station in the open to get at sort of above canopy meteorology. They measured tree basal area in each plot. Each plot was small. It was 3 meters by 3 meters. They also had a portable meteorological station to quantify near ground wind speed, relative humidity, and temperature, as these are factors that are important for flammability. And they also did the really mind-numbingly tedious work of quantifying the fuels. And you can tell that these photos were taken early in the field season by the fact that they're still smiling. And so they measured the type, the biomass, the bulk density of the fuels, and then immediately before burning them, also the moisture of the fuels, and use this information to try to decipher how how tree cover actually influences flammability. And various metrics of flammability were quantified. So I'm going to quickly go through these results. So as a function of tree basal area, we quantified the influence on micrometeorology by comparing our instantaneous measurements with simultaneous measurements at that meteorological station in the open. And what do we find? We find that with increasing tree basal area, you have a reduction in near ground wind speed, you have cooler temperatures, you have higher relative humidity, and what's really important is the lower vapor pressure deficit. That's a measure that's relative for the drying of fuels. In terms of fuels, the total fine fuel load did not differ across the gradient, but what's really important is you have this precipitous decline in grass biomass with increasing tree basal area, but that's largely balanced by an increase in fine woody debris and leaf litter, dicot leaf litter. And so when you combine these two, there's really no net increase or decrease in the fine fuel load. And then these are just some of the metrics of flammability that they quantified. With increasing basal area, the probability of ignition with the experimental ignitions dropped off quite gradually with increasing basal area. Rates of spread, fire line intensity, they all decreased with increasing basal area. But none of this is probably going to be particularly surprising to anyone. But with all of these detailed information, it became possible to decipher what is the relative importance of microclimate versus fuel types and fuel moistures to the flammability differences that we see. And so we use structural equation modeling and focused on ignition success in this figure, but the metrics of fire line intensity, flame length, rates of spread, all showed similar responses. So ignition success, when you look at the direct drivers or the direct effects that determine ignition success, fuel moisture, to a lesser extent fine fuel mode, and to a great extent the percent of grass in that fuel load. Those were factors that influenced ignition success, but then you have these indirect drivers of flammability which are influencing these direct drivers. So you have vapor pressure deficit in the open having a large effect on fuel moisture, but that's also influenced by the basal area of the stand and so on. But what is really useful about this sort of structural equation modeling is that these relative effects can be multiplied to compare the importance of the entire pathways that contribute to ignition. And when you do this, the strongest effect of these indirect drivers was that of basal area, and it had an effect. The strongest effect was mediated by its influence on the amount of grass that's in the fuel load. And so This 0.51 is just a relative measure of the effect size. Now, if you look at the effect of basal area, basal area also had an effect on fuel moisture that influenced success of ignition. But if you multiply those pathways, that effect of basal area that's mediated by its influence on fuel moisture was only about a third as strong as the effect mediated by percent grass. And another very important driver here was that of vapor pressure deficit in the open. So the above canopy climate or meteorology has a large influence on fuel moisture, which has a large influence on ignition success. And that is almost as large as this pathway mediated by grass biomass. But this is not a spatial variable. This is a temporal variable, which is reflecting the daily change in relative humidity and temperature, as well as the seasonal change over the duration of the study. So this effect just emphasizes in the strength of this effect that even though grasses are the primary determinant across the tree gradient, when we have to consider the seasonality and its influence, or the temporal variation in meteorology and its influence on flammability. So, but one other sort of upside of these results is that once forest has encroached, it's really hard to get that site to burn and very difficult to get back. And this is something we're struggling with in our experiment. We're just having a real difficult time in getting these sites that have been encroached by forests, getting them to burn and trying to revert them to savanna. And we've resorted to in some of these to partial thinning of the overstory forest species but even to make it more flammable. But even so, it may be quite some time before this ever looks like a savanna again. So, in short, savanna is largely flammable because of grass. I'm going to flip really quickly through these next slides, just in the interest of time. Those grasses really disappear once tree leaf area index exceeds about 3. And here, this difference in vegetation structure or crown structure between savanna and forest species becomes really important. And if you look at the allometric relationship between leaf area and stem diameter, this is on a log scale, so this is actually quite large. You see that for a given stem diameter, these forest species have substantially higher leaf area for a similarly sized plant. But also remember that forest species grow much more quickly than savanna species. So if you combine the faster diameter growth rate by the greater investment in leaf area, you can get a projection. This is a very simple projection based on some assumed starting point that if you have a site occupied by forest species, and you don't have any fire, you get a much more rapid increase in leaf area index than when you have a site occupied only by savanna species. And if you take that threshold canopy density of 3 as the point in which the grasses are excluded, you need a much longer time for a site that only contains savanna species to ever become something resembling a forest structure. Even so, that may not ever happen. In our current study, we now have 4 years of growth data examining the increase in basal area of both savanna species and forest species in the same plots across this gradient of woody plant encroachment. And what we see is that if we only look at how the basal area of forest species changes over those 4 years as a function of basal area, what we see is that even with these relatively high basal areas, forest species are still contributing to an increase in the total basal area of the plot. But savanna species, those remnant savanna species that are still in these dense sites, they're disappearing, and they're dying gradually, and they're undergoing a decline in total basal area in the plots, and so this intersect. Well, this line is if you take where this 0 would intersect here, that should be theoretically the maximum basal area that a site could achieve if it only contains savanna species. Anyway, so suggesting that it may never be possible to get a true, the level of canopy closure that is required for a forest to. So it's very unlikely that a forest tree will reach an adult size in a frequently burned savanna. But if they are present, if adult large forest trees are present, canopy, the vegetation canopy, if they're not present, yeah, if it's only savanna species present, probably the site could never become dense enough to retard burning. And one last point, we have an experiment. This is a long-running experiment at a forest boundary, Savanna-Forest boundary near Brasilia, in which we've either irrigated these plots or we've added really high levels of all the macro and micronutrients, or we've done both. What we wanted to do is eliminate either water deficit or nutrients as potential limiting factors. So we're not looking at which nutrients might be limiting. We just want to give them enough water or give them enough nutrients to ensure that those are not limiting factors. And what we found was that when we look at the growth rate as a function of either water availability and nutrient addition, the irrigation had no effect on the growth rate, no significant effect, but nutrient addition had about a 70% increase in the growth rate of these. This is only the subset of data from within the savanna portion of these transects. And what's really noteworthy is that the forest species responded much more strongly to nutrient addition than the savanna species. So if you multiply the already higher tendency for forest species to grow more quickly than savanna species within savanna, and you further enhance that, for example, in a high resource environment, a high nutrient environment, the ability for these savanna species forest species to transform the environment by their rapid growth and their dense canopy becomes even all the more stronger. So conclusions, there have been many independent origins of savanna trees in the cerrado. Fire has exerted strong selection on the traits that fundamentally influence vegetation dynamics. There are these two thresholds that can govern the dynamics of savanna-forest boundary, largely the bark thickness at which a stem becomes fire resistant, and the canopy density at which grasses are excluded. As a suite of traits that have a large influence on the dynamics of these savanna-forest boundaries, growth rate of these trees, the crown density of them, and their investment in bark really are three traits that have a really large influence on dynamics. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for this nice and insightful talk. So we will open now to questions. So if participants would like to write their questions on their chat, and then I can go through them, and I will ask you to, perhaps I will call your name and ask you to directly make the question to Bill. So I might start with just a general comment. I really like how you build the story together on the evolution of the savanna and the many origins, and how fire has really played an important role in shaping the savanna. So one of the things that it's said is that, well, and we know that with the lack of fire, we are having all this forest encroachment, and you were talking that once it has been invaded, it's very difficult to return the fire into the system. So what would be, if you were, for instance, a restoration manager in charge of restoring a savanna site, what would be your recommendations on action plans?
Well, I would say my recommendation would be to get started before it becomes a forest. And I mean, Giselle de Durgan, my collaborator at this site, would be can answer this because she's done a lot of work on restoration of savannas and once they've been invaded by exotic grasses. And that's a real problem. Our grasses seem to be much weaker colonizers than these awful African grasses that have been brought in for pastures. And so we have some of these sites. So I'd say my answer regarding that would be to, if you're going to do it and you don't have a plan for doing something about any invasive grasses that might be there, probably devote your effort to a place that's still savanna and try to maintain fire there, maintain it as a good, healthy savanna. I know that's a cop-out, but I don't know. It's just we have some of our sites that that were more on the edge of, still flammable. Some of them we have problems of Eurocloa just taking over the sites, and that's really sad to see.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have so Yadvinder says that has a question about nutrient limitation. Yadvinder, would you like to? And I would like to invite people to, if they want to open their cameras, perhaps it makes it much nicer for the speaker to see people actually behind. So whoever has a good internet, and feel free to open your cameras. Yadvinder?
Hi, Bill. Thank you. That was a really lovely, terrific overview of the whole framework of savanna-forest coexistence. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for that. The question I had was, I was struck by this nutrient limitation story that came through at the end, and how that fits into your overall framework of fire driving these threshold phenomena. I can imagine one seedlings that are can like to grow fast, therefore the forest species there are intrinsically more nutrient demanding.
I'm sorry, you were breaking up there. I missed the first part.
Sorry. Yeah, it was about, so I think I'm trying to understand how this nutrient limitation story fits into your overall framework. And I can see one way is that forest seedlings benefit from being nutrient demanding species because faster growth means the chance of escaping the fire trap is better. And so therefore intrinsically, the forest species have more nutrient demands than the savanna species there. Is that how it goes? And also linked to that is this specific to, say, the area that you've studied that has very nutrient poor soils? Or do you think this is a general response you would see in other more fertile savannas, such as the savannas we get in West Africa, for example?
I think well, I wouldn't claim that the nutrient addition response from this one site would explain anything at other sites. I think it quite likely would be relevant to other savanna sites in the cerrado, which are on similar soils. Now, so these soils are very low in cations and phosphorus and pretty much everything. But so I think they are, so the specific response to nutrients is probably can't be extrapolated everywhere, and certainly probably shouldn't be extrapolated to our site in southeastern Brazil. And something about our site in southeastern Brazil the tree growth rate is notably faster than in our site in around Brasilia, where the nutrient addition experiment was done. And so I would hypothesize that it has to do with differences in nutrient addition between the two sites. I actually haven't compared soil information at the two sites, but I say how you would extend this is just anything that, whatever factor is limiting tree growth in a given area, in a given savanna, if you relax that limiting factor, you should accelerate the transition to forest. I mean that's probably the greatest generalization I would try to make. So elsewhere, water is going to be important, and maybe in some of these savanna or dry savannas on sandy soils that are in Minas Gerais of Brazil, probably, we would have seen a very different effect there. I don't know. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
No.
It does. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Rodrigo Velho. I would like to invite you if you would like to open your mic and make the question, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoffmann. Thank you for your lecture. I'd like to know, since fire plays some considerable role on Cerrado's tree history, in your opinion, would you say that some of those plant features you mentioned in your lecture are more like to adaptations or acceptations to fire resistance? I think there's some controversial opinions about it, so I'd like to know what you think about it. Thank you very much.
Well, actually, that's a fascinating question, and it's related to the point which I attempted to make about the lineages that gave rise to savanna species may not be a random sample. Probably is not a random sample of all the tropical forestry lineages, and I think the question of adaptation versus exaptations is very relevant there, because which species, this is related to the point about the diversity of the functional diversity of the savanna is in part really a mirror of the functional diversity of the species that gave rise to those lineages, the savanna lineages. But if you now consider that probably the forest species from the wettest sites probably didn't, like the true wet tropical forest species probably had a much lower probability of giving rise to savanna species, either because they were not in close vicinity of savannas to make the jump, or and also probably equally important, because they they just had traits that made it less likely that they would have any chance of surviving in the savannas. So so it would be interesting to try to do a much more expansive examination of the traits that included sort of those lineages that didn't give rise to savanna species, those lineages that did give rise to savanna species, and try to partition out the role of exaptations versus adaptations. But by focusing on these congeneric species pairs, those differences that we do see between the savanna and forest species, I'm fairly confident that those do represent adaptations, because we've sort of eliminated that exaptations.
Thank you very much.
Does that answer your question? Well,
yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Kimberly Simpson. Kimberly, are you there? Would you like to make your question?
I am, yes, thank you very much. Thanks for a great talk, Bill. I particularly enjoyed your guidelines for becoming a savanna tree. Oh, excellent.
You remember anything, remember those.
Yeah. So my question was just about whether in your savanna-forest species trait comparisons that you showed in the first half of the talk, whether there could be any age effects that kind of contribute to your findings. So I'm particularly thinking about the differences in relative bark thickness, and whether, I don't know if you said in your description of the methodology, whether these were all trees of the same age or what. But yeah, I just wondered whether age effects might come into your findings.
I can hazard a guess. So no, we did not take age into account because it would be difficult to do. But the only thing that I could hazard a guess as to how age might influence something independently of the size is I do believe, we haven't measured this, but it is my impression that a slower growing individual of a species, for the, if you could partition individuals within a species, so like for a 5 centimeter diameter stem, we consider those individuals that reached 5 centimeters quickly versus those that reached 5 centimeters slowly, because it's just a slower growing individual or whatever, it's in conditions that it's slower growing. My impression is the faster you get to 5 centimeters, the thinner your bark is going to be. So a slower growing individual on a per diameter basis, I believe, would have thicker bark. That's just my impression from having measured a lot of trees, but it's not something we've quantified.
Thank you.
Okay. We don't have any questions in the chat at the moment. Oh yeah, there's one from Carlota. Carlota Segura, would you like to make your question?
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to inquire a bit more about these invasive grasses that you were talking about, and that they are planting in, or they have been planted in these Brazilian savannas. And yeah, I wanted to know, like, what are the greatest challenges that you see regarding these invasive grasses, and whether there are any noticeable differences in the way these grasses burn in relation to the native grasses?
Yeah, and my answer here is not really going to be the result of any of my own work, but what we do know is the majority of these African grasses, they're really difficult to get rid of. Well, there's one exception to this is Melinus minutiflora, and I think Emma has worked on this in Brasilia, where frequent burning does seem to be really good at keeping that species in check. Other species such as andropogons and urocloas, which are really better pasture grasses and are more widely planted these days, it's almost a hopeless cause, I think, at least based on current knowledge. I don't know of any success in really getting rid of them on a large scale once they're established. And once they, if they're in conditions that they're succeeding well, they really, they have a terrible impact on this massive herbaceous diversity that are in these savannas. So Giselle de Dirk has had success with local use of herbicide, but that's really difficult because you're getting, it's difficult to control that without getting the native species. And once you eliminate it, you're creating conditions where, the lack of vegetation cover is just perfect for the reestablishment of those African grasses, and it's really troublesome, and it's a real worry of mine, and certainly a lot of work. I wish there were good answers for that, and another challenge that comes is that those really bad savanna grasses that are bad for biodiversity are the ones that tend to be the really good ones for pastures. And so they're planted all over. And so as the cerrado becomes more and more fragmented, that just increases the contact area for these savanna grasses to establish, these pasture grasses to establish.
Yeah, make it look as if you're wanting to.
Hmm.
Way. Oh,
I don't know. How
Thank
many
you.
people there are.
Hey, William.
Hello.
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I tried to do the chat thing, but it doesn't seem to have gone through. Great talk as always, Bill. Eloquent and elegant.
Thank you.
I was wondering, there've been quite a few papers suggesting that mega herbivores were roaming right over the cerrado. And what you are implying with your work is fire has been the major selective agent. Would you see any traits amongst those plants that suggest to you that mega herbivores were also a selective agent, or that they weren't? Can we use plants to work out where the mega herbivores really were?
Well, I should probably be asking you that, because you you know the mega herbivores. You know, in the cerrado we see cows and horses and such. But you know, I recall a nice talk that you gave at ATBC in what was out in the Pantanal, where you looked at our cerrado species and scoffed at the lack of any sort of physical defense against herbivores. So I will turn this around to you, and but I think you're right. I mean, it's such a unless those are traits that would be lost very quickly. Through evolutionary time, you know, it's such an easy environment to work in, and the only thorny things to run into are some little smilax, viney things, very few thorns. I don't know what I mean, but then again, I guess those are not typical traits in some of the low nutrient mesic, like the Combretum, Terminalia savannas in Africa as well. So what in those Terminalia, Combretum savannas are indications of a role of herbivores? I'm asking you that.
Well, one very striking difference is tensile strength. The cerrado, those trees just collapse, they fall to pieces. The wood is extraordinarily brittle. You can knock over a tree in a few minutes. You can't do that to African trees. So I would imagine if they did put in some elephants, they would cause absolute trashing of the tree layer very quickly in cerrado. But I don't know. I don't know but I think it's an interesting question. Is this a fantasy being dreamt up that the mega herbivores could be spread right across the cerrado? And if so, where were they in Brazil, in the cerrado realm? Anyway,
I mean, I'm not.
There's no distraction from your talk, so I'll shut up.
No. But it is a very interesting topic, and you know, I'm not very knowledgeable about the fossil record, but my impression is that the fossil record for within the cerrado proper is not the greatest. It's really around the periphery, and I think the Caatinga and the Chaco would be excellent candidates for these mega herbivores, and you find thorns in those flora. So anyway, yeah.
Great, thanks very much.
Just to follow, as there's no question in the box, just to follow up, why wouldn't they be in the cerrado if they were there? Is it the nutrients of the cerrado are unusually poor compared to, say, African savanna nutrients or other things? You've got the semi-open environment with grasses. Why wouldn't you have mega herbivores when roaming around there?
Yeah, I think it's nutrients, the low nutrient availability. The leaves don't seem particularly palatable. They're all these thick leather, cardboard-like leathery leaves. But yeah, that would be my explanation. Again, I'm not a animal guy.
Okay. Well, if there's anyone that would like to contribute to that discussion, just
Yeah,
feel
more
free.
speculation.
Those leaves are the leaves in those trees. Some of them are so tough you could shave with them. You know, they are absolutely the most inedible leaves I've seen anywhere. But it would be interesting to try it out on the animals and see what elephants do eat. Appalling stuff. But I think cerrado would be just the ultimate insult to a poor hungry elephant. Anyway, be interesting to try the experiment and trash some cerrado while you're doing it.
I think we might be happy with the bark. The inner bark might. I mean, that's full of carbohydrates, and to the extent which which with elephants strip off bark and consume that inner bark, they might be happy eating some of the woody plants.
Yeah, we may have more insights later. We have in this same series of talks on the 11th of December, we're going to have Vinicius Dantas, who's going to be talking about megafauna history and biome ecology in South America.
Oh, excellent.
That's excellent. He might be able to contribute to that. And I think we have as well some comments from Fernando Silveira. Fernando, would you like to say your thoughts that you posted in the chat? Okay, so I'm going to read it then. He says no mic. So he said that most fossils described by Lund came from the cerrado, and there is also some evidence of reducing genetic diversity in species with anachronic fruits. That's his comment.
Just a bit of anecdote on the fossil record. I remember giving a talk at Nova Giaconcino in Mato Grosso, which is undoubtedly in the Cerrado biome, at the Amazonian end of that biome. And the museum there has collections of stegomastodons with tusks, elephants and things from that region there. So clearly, at least in that locality, there were stegomastodons, elephants, essentially roaming in something that must have been Cerrado-like as a biome.
Okay. Kate, would you like to pose your question about grasses and fallibility, please?
She's got no microphone.
Sorry, no mic. Okay, so Kate Parr is asking, what are the grasses like regarding fallibility? And she's referring to the native grasses, the native grasses, sorry, not the introduced ones.
Well, again, I don't know this. I look at grasses and I see fuel rather than food. So with the palatability, I mean, maybe there are other people here that have better information, but I mean, what we know from grazing in the cerrado, extensive grazing is possible within the cerrado, but you can't get nearly as high densities of cows on an area of land as you can get when you bring in these African grasses. The native grasses, either their productivity or their palatability do seem to be limiting, and perhaps you know, and often when the African grasses are brought in, if you want to make money, you need to fertilize. You're likely going to fertilize if you want to get the maximum number of heads. But that's certainly, the African grasses don't need that because they do become problems where fertilization hasn't occurred. So I don't know. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, good. Actually, following on that, I was curious because in one study that we did some time ago, actually with African grasses, and we also found that grasses actually was the main driver of ignitions, and that was very mediated though through the species composition. So grass species by composition, but more than biomass per se. And I was wondering if you have done any work on parsing apart the grass species level, and I'm also talking about native grasses in your experiments and looking at that.
So sorry, if I have experience with.
So if you have done any work with grasses and flammability at the species level, so looking at the specific flammability of grasses.
We have not done anything. We've done some of that with woody plants. Well, last year we were looking at flammability of savanna and forest trees, and are working on that. And the results are largely similar to what has been seen elsewhere. But one interesting twist on it is that these aluminum accumulating trees, which are pretty, there are quite a few species, they burn really poorly. But sorry, that's not anything to do with grasses. I don't have any insight. This African grass, Melinus minutiiflora, and that actually, there was a question back that in terms of flammability of these exotic grasses, because they produce higher biomass, and in the case of Melinus, is particularly flammable, you can get much hotter fires as a result. But you're wondering within the
native community, yeah.
We haven't looked.
So
yeah. I'm looking at this question by Fernando Silveira, and I don't know if I fully understand it. So the fossils described by Lund, were those in the was it Sechulagoas, or what was the site where there was a lot of fossils down in Minas Gerais or São Paulo? But going back a couple of comments we didn't really address. A comment from Fernando Silveira. Oh,
from Fernando Silveira, yeah, about the fossils actually, yeah. We kind of.
And I'm not sure what an anachronic fruit is. What's an anachronic fruit, anyone?
Anachronistic.
Oh, a fruit that no longer has the disperser available. Yeah, well, yeah, things like some of the anonas and hymenea have fruit, which, but those things do get dispersed, and things like rheas or emmas can probably do something with them. I don't know. I don't want to make any speculation about the role of the megafauna. I think it's a fascinating question, and I don't have any useful insights into that. Sorry.
Well, I don't know if you want me to comment.
Oh, Evanesius.
Yeah. Well, there is some evidence that, but it's based on data from extant species. They used these extant species for that coexisted with megafauna species from South America, and used this to infer the distribution of megafauna. And there is some evidence that there were lots of grader and browsers in the cerrado region. What we don't know is if the species that occur in the cerrado today were the same species that occurred in the past, so whether these species were, I don't know, restricted to some location, so and then expanded after megafauna extinction. But there is also, I used to think that perhaps there is little evidence that there was a strong selective pressure by megafauna over cerrado species. But now I'm thinking that perhaps the way species are defended against herbivores may be different in moister and drier climates. So, and I'm considering this possibility that species in the cerrado are defended, especially with leaf defenses and wood with leaf defenses. But perhaps, but I also think that some of the species from the cerrado may have expanded, may have occurred in refugees, and then now after megafauna extinction, with the rise of more frequent fires and things like that, they were able to expand. But this is just speculation. What I know is that species in the cerrado, for now, seems to have little defenses against many herbivores, except perhaps for leaf defense. I don't know if this contributes, but there is evidence that there was megafauna, plenty of a high diversity. In fact, the eastern part of South America seems to have been the most megafauna species rich part of South America. But we have also that these animals were generally smaller compared to animals that occur, for example, in the Chaco region, more to the south. And I have been thinking that perhaps cerrado species have, species in the region have interacted with many herbivores, although I don't know if these are the same species that today dominate in the area. So.
Yeah, so that's thanks for the information, and I'll certainly be looking forward to you talking about. So you're going to be talking about. You're going to give us all a summary of the megafauna in December. I could really benefit from an overview of what's known and what's not known about all of that. So, what's
that's Friday, December the 11th at 4 p.m. Anybody wants to do it?
Yeah.
Great.
In this talk, I'm planning to discuss a paper that I have written with Julie Powder, which is not published yet. It's only published as a preprint, in which we did this evaluation of potential megafauna effects on plant traits and biome distribution for the entire neotropical realm. So it's already in the internet. If you look for it, you can find it. And I'll be talking about it a little bit.
Okay, good.
Great. Thanks, Vinicius. And looking forward for your talk as well.
Thank you.
So if there are no further questions, maybe we will wrap it up here, Bill. So yeah, thank you very much for your really good, insightful talk. I really much enjoyed it. I also really like the tips for how to be a savanna species. I think that's really great. And I want to thank also all the attendants and everyone. And
thank you very much.
It was a real pleasure to have you in our seminars. So thank you.
I'll have to tune into these now.
Actually, just a note for those of you who are regularly tuning in from abroad, the clocks in the UK change this weekend. So from next week, the time will be 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So for some of you, there might be an hour's difference from the time that you've been listening to these.
Exactly.
Right.
And yeah.
Thanks very much.
You all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.